All right, everybody. Thanks for joining us today on another episode of Snakes Are Everything, kicking off season 2 as our loose seasons go. If you are joining us for the first time, or maybe you're just interested in this topic and don't know about us, we're advocates for snake preservation. We're the ones who are hosting this series. We're a nonprofit organization and we change how people view and treat snakes. I'm Melissa Amarillo. I'm the executive director, and along with Jeff Smith, who's working here in the background, like always, we co-founded Advocates for Snake Preservation in 2014 for this purpose. And just a very little bit about what we do. We provide solutions to human-snake conflicts that sometimes are badly for people, but often prove fatal for snakes. And one of the ways that we do that, and also just something else that we like doing because it helps out snakes in a lot of ways, is that we tell stories about wild snake behavior to counter prevailing myths and make snakes more familiar and less scary. And all of this work, like I said, we're a nonprofit organization. So all of this is made possible by donations, both big and small, including this presentation series, Snakes Are Everything. So today, like I said, we're kicking off season 2 with our 7th episode of Snakes Are Everything. And that is Snakes Are Survivors. I'm super excited to welcome and introduce today's guest, Dr. Erika Nowak, who I've known, well, I first talked to her more than 20 years ago, although that was through email. So, and it's been so long and it was such a quick exchange, like I'm not sure she even remembers, but she was the first person I contacted when I decided that I wanted to move to the Southwest from Kentucky and study snakes, especially rattlesnakes. And I got in touch with Erika, who actually told me that the place to go in Arizona was not Flagstaff to work for her, but that I should head south to Tucson because there was a lot more work going on down there. And so Erika, in a way, if I hadn't done that, I would not have met Jeff Smith, and ASP may not be a thing. So Erika's kind of responsible for ASP becoming a thing as well. But other than that, not that that's not enough, but Erika's done a lot of other awesome stuff too. So she's currently, and this is kind of a mouthful, she's assistant research faculty at the School of Earth and Sustainability, the Department of Biological Sciences, the Center for Adaptable Western Landscapes, and the Colorado Plateau Research Station at Northern Arizona University. She has been studying rattlesnakes since, well, at least the early 90s. And one of the reasons Erika likes rattlesnakes, and I feel the same way, I think a lot of us do once we get to know them, is that she feels a special kinship with them because they are calm, gentle creatures, and yet so misunderstood. Calm and gentle is not how most people describe rattlesnakes, at least not most people who haven't gotten to know them really well. I also like to say that Erika was working on snake conservation before it was cool. That's the only thing that I've ever known her to be working on. And of late, she's focused more of her attention on our local threatened garter snakes, the Mexican garter snakes and the narrow-headed garter snakes, because they definitely need a lot of help. But because both her master's and her PhD work included not only a natural history and ecology of rattlesnakes, such as Western diamondbacks and Arizona blacks, but also a lot of work looking at translocation and the issues surrounding that, both on the snake side and the human side of things. So she continues to publish and give trainings on this topic. And that's what she is going to tell us a little bit more about today. So yeah, whenever you're ready, Erika, you can flip back to sharing your screen and take it away.
Okay, thanks. Okay, thank you, Melissa. Appreciate the nice introduction. And I'm super happy that I was able to influence your life in a positive way, and Jeff's too. That's great. I have been working on rattlesnakes and snake conservation for some time. And this picture here, if you can see, there's a rattlesnake in a what we would call a snake bucket. This is one of my favorite snake survivors. It's a male Western diamondback rattlesnake that we captured as an adult in 1995. He was part of my master's research. He was part of my PhD research. And in between those two periods, he was hit by a car, and yet he's still surviving. If he's with us today, he's, probably 30, 35 years old at this point. So definitely an interesting and long-term survivor of a snake. So and bear with me here while I figure out advancing the slide. Okay. So the title of my talk is Rattlesnakes Are Survivors Sometimes. And so I'm just going to give the punchline away right here, right at the beginning. Based on a review of the literature for moving snakes, 53% of all the adult rattlesnakes and Massasaugas that were translocated outside of their home ranges didn't survive, based on my review of the literature between 1971 and 2019. And so I'm giving you this information up front because I want us to think about that as I go through the presentation. Yes, 47% did survive, but what about the other ones? Why didn't they survive, and what can we do to make that better? I want to start off talking about the fear of snakes, ophidiophobia. And Harry Green and others who have presented in this series, being hosted by ASP, have done a great job in talking about this, but I would like to talk about it relative to translocation. I'll talk a little bit about the history of translocation research in reptiles and amphibians, specifically some of the terminology and the issues associated with not conflating and confusing the terminology. I'll talk about the results of mitigation translocation for rattlesnakes and why it often fails in rattlesnakes in particular. And then talk about some ideas for improving these programs based on some work that Brian Sullivan and Matt Kiewitkowski and Gordon Schuett and Harry Green and so many others have thought about. So ophidiophobia, it is the fear of snakes. And the issue with ophidiophobia is that it can be kind of an extreme fear of snakes. And so most people and many animals, not even just people, but many animals, have either an innate fascination with snakes, or sometimes that's translated to kind of an extreme fear. And that pervades all aspects of humans' interactions with snakes. And so even something as innocuous as this little common adder, shown here with Dr. Palvisalo, who is doing some research on them in Finland. Here's another individual of the same species, about 2 feet long, mildly venomous. Bites typically don't cause very many problems for humans or their pets. Even this small animal, which is common throughout Europe, including Ukraine, this animal is feared and it's persecuted, and it's really hard to manage the situation because people are so fearful of it. And it's way out of proportion to the effect of the venom that the animal actually causes, either on humans and their pets. So Dr. Green, Harry, and I have thought about this, and really it's our opinion that the fear of snakes may be a real threat to their conservation globally. The fear results in inappropriate management, which often results in an increased risk of snake bite and envenomation by venomous snakes. This is not just the US, no, we're talking worldwide. So Harry has been an amazing mentor. He's been with me since I first started my research, and kudos to him for all the support he's given me over the years. Because the fear of snakes is so irrational and it pervades all of our interactions with snakes in many cases, it also affects our ability to manage them well. And I would say that that translates to not being able to do management actions for them well, including translocation. So what is translocation? Well, translocation is simply moving an animal from one place to the other. And it's, in herpetology, it has this acronym: relocation, reintroduction, translocation, and head starting. And these are all different ways of managing animals for the purposes of moving them around. Some of these terms are related more to conservation and restoration of captive bred populations, and others are more related to, I found a snake in my driveway. I don't want it. What do I do with it? I want to get rid of it. It's a nuisance. So that's a different kind of a translocation than, hey, I have an endangered garter snake that I need to recover. What do I do to restore it to its former habitat? There were some early translocation papers that came out in the 70s. One of them was more about copperheads. The second one was actually on Western diamondback rattlesnakes. And that was a paper that was looking at how rattlesnakes use orientation. And it was kind of severe in the methods that it used, but it wasn't really a good example of an early translocation paper. Translocation has been reviewed for the herpetological field, beginning, I would argue, really done well in the 1990s. And then there have been a number of reviews since then. These definitions of translocation are really important because, again, the outcome, the goal, and the purpose of these are different. And so a lot of people think when we talk about translocation, we're talking about taking a population of captive bred or even wild salvage snakes and restore them to their rightful habitat. And this is an issue that's come up when we're thinking about climate change and how do we restore populations either to areas that are better suited for them or even putting them in new habitats where they used to persist but no longer persist. So conservation translocations deal with how to improve the conservation status of the animals, and basically moving populations to help improve their status. Translocation is really, or relocation as the older term was, is the idea that animals are being moved, sometimes not just for conservation, but also for mitigation. In other words, how do we deal with a nuisance animal situation? How do we manage mitigation conflict? And so a term that the IUCN adopted after much poking and prodding and some heated discussions, they adopted this in 2013, is the term mitigation translocation. And this is the idea that animals are being moved because they're considered to be either a problem or because somebody simply doesn't want them where they occur and they should go somewhere else. So from this point forward, for the most part, I'll be discussing mitigation translocation, that is the moving of nuisance animals. Mitigation is a big deal here in the southwestern US where I live. So in Tucson, Arizona, a large urban area in southern Arizona, both venomous snakes, non-venomous snakes, and venomous lizards, Gila monsters, are moved every single year by people who find them in their yards. They're also moved from commercial areas, places where folks are finding them and they don't want them. So there have been a number of reviews of this practice. In 1997, Jude McNally and Trevor Hare talked about the mitigation translocations that was happening with one fire department that they worked with. In 1995, there were 600 snakes that fire department moved. Hugh McChrystal and Craig Ivani did a review of mitigation translocation, moving nuisance animals. They reviewed 6 fire departments between 2002 and 2004. 6,000 animals moved during that time. Rattlesnakes, non-rattlesnakes, Gila monsters. 2021, I did a review for a project I'm working on. The Golder Ranch Fire Department, which is a fire department that's in northeastern Tucson, and it has 10 different fire stations. They only focus on snakes for the most part. In 2021, they removed over 1,770 snakes. So it is a huge issue that's happening throughout the Southwest. It's happening throughout the world. Wherever people are coming into contact with humans, you get mitigation translocations. I became interested in this topic when I was a graduate student, starting my career with the USGS. At that time, it was part of the Colorado Plateau Research Station, hence my very long title. I attended a meeting in Boone, North Carolina, and there was a rattlesnake symposium. I had the good fortune to meet Marty Martin, who is an amazing rattlesnake biologist, long-term researcher, timber rattlesnakes. He's also a super connector. And at that meeting, he introduced me to the people that I needed to know who were working on rattlesnakes. And those contacts have become my mentors, and it's been really invaluable for my career. And so I can't thank my folks enough for just helping me throughout this process. Howard Reinhardt was one of the first people that I met, and he had done a translocation study of timber rattlesnakes, and he had some really odd results. He had pretty high mortality, but a lot of the snakes that were translocated had really unusual behaviors. And I thought that was interesting. I met a guy from the Toronto Zoo, Bob Johnson. He was trying to do a conservation translocation, trying to introduce Massasaugas into a place where they've been extirpated. 100% of those snakes died after they were introduced into the habitat. In Tucson, as I mentioned, it's an ongoing issue with both translocation. The survival rates are not super high, but also folks were seeing that some of these snakes were returning to the places that they were translocated from. So reviewing this literature and then doing my own research formed the basis for my master's thesis in one of my early publications. Here's my data. So I had a relatively small sample size of translocated snakes. I had an equal number that were not translocated. These are the home ranges or the activity ranges of the snakes that were translocated. And you can see that the ranges in red are before the experiment happened, before the snakes were translocated. They were moved outside of their home range. They were studied for a year to see what the home ranges were, and then they were moved a distance to twice what I would normally see them travel during the course of the home range. And the red areas are before the experiment, their home range, and the blue are after. And 4 of these 6 snakes had ranges that increased substantially. One of them had a really big range because that snake just flew off the face of the earth, moved a long distance, and disappeared after it was translocated. We never did find it. 2 of them had pretty small ranges. So there is some individual variation in the response to translocation. But overall, the pattern for these animals was that they moved more frequently and had larger ranges after they were translocated. Of the 7 that were translocated, 4 of them made it back to the park. So they were moved from a national monument into another federal land area. And 2 of them made it back over the course of about a year and a half. These dashed lines are showing the movement patterns of one snake. Solid blue shows the movement pattern of another snake. And both of these guys seem to use triangulation. And then they made it back to the monument. They made it back to their original home ranges. The year after this work was completed, they both died. So one of them moved off the park and was killed by homeowners. The other one apparently picked up a disease and died due to the effects of the disease in this new area. High mortality rates and long distance movements are really common themes of animals that are translocated, whether it's rattlesnakes, other species of vipers, other snakes, echidnas, parrots, fish, turtles, salamanders, a number of mammals. As we know, grizzly bears capable of really long distance movements. These patterns are really common throughout the literature when you start to review it for vertebrates. Animals who are displaced try to return home. And when they're trying to return home, they have really large distance movements. They move more frequently, so they're moving more often. They're moving at weird times of the year. A lot of these rattlesnakes are moving during the winter when they should be hibernating, using the loose definition of hibernation for a snake that overwinters. A lot of times their behavior changes. They don't have the same chemical profile that a normal snake would have. They have, for whatever reason, that's changed, and so they act differently than other snakes. Other snakes treat them differently. Their habitat use changes. They're not picking suitable hibernation sites. So what this means is that, again, the literature that I reviewed, 53% of the adults ended up dying as a result of being moved out of their home ranges. When you look at the translocation effects on short distance movements, so in other words, when animals are moved just within their home range, some would argue that this is actually not really a translocation, but when you move an animal within its home range just to remove it from an area where it's contacting humans, mortality rates are 34%, which is within range of a normal adult rattlesnake mortality, but still it's slightly higher. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Here's some of these data. Again, this is based on a review of studies looking at long distance translocation of adult snakes between 1973 and 2019. and increased movements, increased range sizes, number of the studies, increased frequency of movements, moving in winter or just kind of the wrong time of the year. The data on stress and changes in hormones is mixed. Some people saw that, others didn't. Mortality rates typically higher. And then occasionally we do see studies where there were no significant effects determined. Or some of the effects were not significant. Yes, the snakes moved longer, but they didn't actually have higher mortality rates. So there is kind of a number of different potential responses here. It's not necessarily true that if you translocate a rattlesnake, it will die. And I've heard people say this as a result of my research, but that is not true. It is variable. Some snakes are good survivors, others don't do so well. Brian Sullivan and Matt Kwiatkowski and I published this in a paper that came out in 2014, where we basically reviewed the literature focusing on mitigation translocation. There was another really neat paper that's just come out of Australia where they did even a greater review, really diving deep into the literature, not just for Australia, but other places as well, including a lot of our rattlesnake data. And one of the themes of their abstract was that they don't recommend long distance translocation as a way for dealing with nuisance snakes. Rather than moving these guys long distances and seeing a lot of failures, either because the snake dies or because it returns, or because it returns and then it dies, they recommend using short distance translocation. In other words, translocation within the snake's home range. So why? Why does this happen? Why does this fail for this group of animals? And again, for each group of animals, that answer will probably differ, but think about the natural history of rattlesnakes. So we know that they're really long-lived. Based on my research, some of the research coming out of the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic states, 50 years old for timber rattlesnakes. And these include females that are breeding at 40 and 50 years of age. Many rattlesnake populations and other temperate vipers are very energetically efficient. So they can eat a mouse, a few mice, a rabbit, maybe just eat a few times a year and translate that immediately into growth and reproduction and producing more babies. So it doesn't take a whole lot of energy to sustain these animals. And because of that, they have pretty slow lifestyles, especially in cooler, more temperate areas. Potentially as a result of this, they don't seem to change very quickly when their environment changes rapidly. And this is a little bit alarming given some of the predictions for climate change and drought, especially here in the Southwest, and catastrophic fires. So there have been a number of studies, including some of my own work, looking at either habitat manipulations, catastrophic fires, or prey manipulations to see if rattlesnakes would change, or even as a retrospective study to see if they would change their behavior and habitat use after these perturbations. And the results were negative. They didn't, as a population or as a group, they didn't have a good response to changing. Now, some animals, sure, they were a little more on top of things and they could change, but a lot of them just simply didn't adapt. And many of them ended up dying in these situations or just not adapting and changing their behavior or their ecology. Thinking about that spatial ecology, in temperate environments, especially in warmer temperate environments like here in Arizona, venomous reptiles and rattlesnakes have pretty small home ranges. Now, this is not the case for species that live at higher latitudes or cooler areas. Some of them have pretty large home ranges, but here in the Southwest, we're talking maybe less than a kilometer from where they hibernate to the farthest point in their range. Some rattlesnakes do include anthropogenic features. In other words, they're not necessarily scared about living around human habitation, which is why they tend to show up in people's yards. But it's interesting that maybe not all species are equally tolerant. Some preliminary data coming out of Tanto National Monument showing that Arizona black rattlesnakes tended to avoid areas where humans were, compared to something like the Western diamondback rattlesnakes, which were much more tolerant. Really critical thing, no matter how big the range size, rattlesnakes have high site fidelity. So they use the same hibernation dens year after year. They use the same areas in the summer for shedding their skins. Females and sometimes males go back to the same rookeries where the females give birth. They use the same hunting areas. They use the same migration routes. So you can kind of predict from one route to the next where they'll be. And Melissa, as part of her master's work, found that they have really complex social behaviors. And a number of studies are coming out now showing this really complex parental care. both females taking care of their babies, potentially unrelated females taking care of their babies, and even males attending babies. So these social patterns are super important in terms of their life cycles. And this may have some effect on, if you disrupt that, that probably has negative effects on their success of them in new habitats. A couple of maps of animals from Tanto National Monument. So there are two different rattlesnakes shown here. One is channel 28, Western Diamondback rattlesnake female, and then 24. This dotted area here is the trail to the lower cliff dwellings at Tanto National Monument. And then these little bullseyes are the housing area at Tanto National Monument. Diamonds indicate hibernation sites. 28 has pretty much the same range year after year. Her footprint is not very variable. 24, a little bit different. She's moving around. She has smaller home range when she's pregnant, bigger home range when she's not. Different hibernation sites that she uses. And so these are examples of hibernation sites that my snakes have used in the studies that I've worked on. And I'd like to draw your attention to hibernation sites. So the arrows indicate hibernation sites. And so some of these are a little more typical, where you see the big rocky outcrops, and then you see places like the lower arrow here on the right-hand picture, where it's the lower cliff dwelling trail, and that animal is hibernating in that location. Tuzigoot National Monument, the rattlesnakes are hibernating in rocky outcrops, but they're also hibernating in the Sanawa ruins at Tuzigoot. So just a variety of hibernation sites that they can use. And again, they are using these anthropogenic features. All right. So it is possible that by our actions of living in rattlesnake habitat and just coexisting with them in the world, we are creating shelter sites that they can use. And so the picture on the left with the snake tail coming out of the pipe, that's actually the ruins at Tuzigoot National Monument. And the snake is entering those ruins for hibernation and retreat sites during the summer when it's hot. The picture on the right shows a bird bath in one of the housing areas at Tanto National Monument. And so here we have a situation where we're feeding and watering birds. Are we attracting the prey for the rattlesnakes? And will that attract rattlesnakes over the long term? That's also a possibility. So we are interacting with the snakes in a way that may be creating more of a problem in certain contexts. So mitigation translocation is problematic. Snakes are capable of returning. They have high mortality rates. We may be creating more of a problem depending on how we interact with snakes around our habitation. So what can we do to improve the idea that not everybody is going to be tolerant about snakes? You know, we could bury our heads in the sand like this Paranguay's adder in Namibia, but the reality is that snakes and humans will continue to come into conflict, and snakes and people will continue to be afraid of each other. So how do we try to manage this the best way possible if we decide that translocation is the best way to do this? Brian Sullivan and Matt Kiwakowski and Gordon Schuett and I would argue that terminology is super important. And so this is that paper that we gave at the World Congress of Herpetology in 2012. If the goal of your program is to rehabilitate a population, that is not the same goal as removing a snake from a nuisance situation. Because the goal is different, the outcomes will be different. And it's really important to keep these straight and not read reviews of conservation translocation and think, oh, great, there's no problem with this. It'll be fine. We can just translocate these animals. A lot of other studies have had great success. You need to think about that conservation translocation is separate from mitigation translocation. And I'm not going to belabor this point any further because Brian will be giving a talk on this very topic at the Western Park meetings, Partners in Amphibian and Reptile Conservation, coming up in April. And there's a website there for southwestpark.org talking about that particular meeting. So please do catch Brian's talk. You'll hear more information about this. For a lot of the species of vipers that have been studied, including rattlesnakes, we have very little information. And so how can we do a translocation program or any sort of a management program without understanding their basic ecology, their behavior, and their biology? It turns out that relative to other groups of organisms, snakes in particular, probably because of ophidiophobia, are really pretty well understudied and not very well represented in the literature. There's been kind of a bias against publishing snake data in the literature for some time. And a number of people have talked about this in papers that they've written, either on the topic or in passing. This lack of information affects our ability to manage the animals appropriately. First of all, just to understand what their basic needs are. Do all life stages use the same habitat? Within the habitat, do they all use the same vertical structure? Or for some tropical vipers, does that change as they get older or younger? Are there differences there? What are the seasonal habitat differences? When it's drier, do they tend to hang out closer to water sources? Or do they just have a really stable range that doesn't change that much and they just hope to find water? So there are differences, again, between temperate and tropical species. It's very common that many young rattlesnakes use different prey than older rattlesnakes do. And so we need to know how those prey are using the habitat as well. Different animals in different locations have different movement patterns and different movement distances. So what is the typical home range of a viper? It's going to be pretty different here in Arizona, even compared to between Flagstaff, where I am, in Tucson, and between Flagstaff and Finland, for example, where the archipelago vipers were that Dr. Salvo studied. This is a critical issue. Somewhere around 40% of the viper species in the world have not been assessed by the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. This was as of 2019. Of the species that have been assessed, what is their conservation status? Are they declining, in danger of extinction? How are they doing? Somewhere between 9 and 20% are so data deficient that we can't even decide what their conservation status is. So this is a really big problem, this lack of knowledge. Irrespective of the lack of knowledge, there are things that we know that we can do to improve the outcomes. So we need to figure out, for the species that we know, first of all, what data needs do we have? And then why are they attracted to the areas where they are attracted to? Is it however many years of an extreme drought in Arizona? So 15 years, longer? Are snakes concentrating near water sources? And if that's a problem, maybe we can move those water sources further from our yards if we're feeding and watering birds, for example, in our yards. Are there prey? Are we doing things that are attracting prey to our built environments? Are we providing shelter? So this is an example here on the bottom of a structure as part of the Central Arizona Project, which is a water utility, where they've had a number of snakes outside of this building. It turns out that this building, this power structure, is the only building for some distance in the middle of a flat open creosote field. And so that building is attracted to these snakes because it provides really stable area. It's cooler in the summer and warmer in the winter. And as evidenced by the picture of that snake skin, many snakes take advantage of this to use it for both winter hibernation areas as well as summer retreat sites. But there's a lot of cultural transmission that I think happens with snakes. And here is me waving my arms. But I believe, based on some evidence from a number of studies, that there is cultural transmission of migration routes between one generation of snakes to the next. And that these historic travel patterns are followed by successive generations of snakes. We know that snakes can use olfaction to follow the trails of other snakes and to gain information about those snakes. And so why wouldn't there be some sort of transmission of that information over generations? Not necessarily that the scent is staying from year to year, but those animals are staying from year to year and transmitting the information. So thinking about that, there may be things that the snakes are doing which may be almost impossible to manage for, except that if we are familiar with what's happening, we can understand, for example, when we're building a new visitor center in a national park, we know that snakes have used these areas year after year. Why don't we elevate the trails, get the snakes above the people so that we're not invading those spaces that we know the snakes are already existing in? Which is an example of human modifications to decrease the use by snakes and or decrease the contact between humans and snakes. Choosing National Monument, we know that snakes are hibernating in the ruins, or they used to. Well, 20 years ago, they put a screen over the ruins. They put a screen over the drainage pipes. Snakes are no longer using those ruin structures for retreat sites. So that's a pretty simple fix. one thing that we can think about is how do we improve translocations, not just mitigation translocations, but all translocations. And one way to think about this is, what have the folks in conservation translocation, what have they done? What have they found to be successful? The results of those conservation translocations can help us figure out what to do for mitigation translocation. A lot of this is based on turtle and tortoise work, some work with amphibians. And these folks are just thinking about this all the time. How do we plan for emergencies? How do we get out in advance of those catastrophic wildfires that we know are coming down the line, especially in areas where we have federally protected populations? What can we do to help those animals recover from those populations? Maybe we need to move social groups. This is not something that was been thought about so much in snakes in terms of translocation, but we know from Melissa's work that this is really important to snakes. Rule and Clark and others have also seen similar social interactions. If an animal, a rattlesnake, needs to be moved, think about whether it's an animal that hibernates over the winter and move it to an area that has suitable shelter sites or den sites earlier in the season, so that the animal has an ability to find those good hibernation sites, go through kind of recovery from translocation, and then start moving around normally and hopefully find a good site before the freezing cold temperatures of the winter. Some studies have looked at soft release. In other words, animals are penned and then they're released after some acclimation period. Maybe we need to release them with water. This is becoming a really big issue here in the Southwest. This is an example of an animal drinking, telemetered tortoise drinking from a pool of water that's been provisioned to it. Monitoring is super important. And so we need to understand our animals before we do this translocations, but then also monitor them afterwards. And if you do a translocation and you move an animal and you look at it a couple months before, and then you look at it a couple months afterwards, if that's a little tree lizard that has a very short lifespan, great. That's an appropriate time to monitor the animal. But if you're looking at tortoises living 70 plus years, rattlesnakes 30 to 50 years, monitoring your animals for just a few months or even a year after you release them is probably not going to tell you very much about how they ultimately survive. There's also publication bias. And so there's both publication bias that's self-centered, where people are reluctant to publish negative data, but there's also negative pressure within the translocation community to actively squelch certain papers that go against prevailing wisdom. And so we need to kind of get around that. We need to publish negative results, and we need to accept that results that are published may also be counterintuitive to what we would think. And we need to not just disregard these studies if we get those kind of results. Really important step, and I think Robin actually may be on the talk here, but the translocation of animals is happening throughout the world, and it's happening at different levels, different species. A lot of people around the world are working on this problem simultaneously. A lot of us really care about snakes and we want to help them. And so doing our best to train people who are doing these translocations on the most safe way to handle the snakes and the safest way to translocate them is the best thing we can do to improve their chances of survival. And again, it doesn't matter whether it's emergency responders in India or military personnel in Arizona. The more that we can do to educate folks about snakes and their habits and their ecology, and as Melissa mentioned, their behavior, the more that those trainers will be successful at encouraging snakes to survive and decrease the incidence of venomous snake bite by encouraging proper interactions with the snakes. By the same token, these things all also apply to the public. The more that we can educate people of any age about how important snakes are, their roles in the environment, and really the need to try to coexist as much as possible, the better chances for survival. In some places, not so much here in the US, but in some places, snakes are a huge, serious health threat, and people are afraid of them for really good reasons. They do cause a lot of morbidity, mortality in humans. And so in those places, we have to work within the local communities to be respectful as possible of the local traditions, but also encourage them to, within the areas, to the level that they're comfortable with, try to live with snakes as much as possible, rather than either trying to kill them or just getting rid of them, moving them long distances. Without taking a huge amount of time thinking about conservation studies, introduction, reintroduction, repatriation studies, Melissa mentioned my work with the narrow-headed garter snakes. We are doing some captive husbandry work. Formerly, we've done some captive breeding. I'd like us to get to a point where we can do some releases. But we need to be really mindful of what habitats the animals exist in, what are their prey base, and basically do as much research as we can beforehand so that we don't have a situation like this picture here on the left, where we have a snake who was salvaged from a situation where there was a catastrophic wildfire and snakes were starving and dying in the population as a result of the fire. There was a big introduction study that was done, monitored for a short period of time. There were a number of issues with the translocation and introduction. It was ultimately successful, but there are ways that we can improve this just simply by planning ahead of getting ahead of these catastrophic events. And many of the same amounts of information that I've given you relative to improving mitigation translocation apply directly to conservation translocation. Okay, so one of the questions that I hear a lot is, well, you know, so-and-so, they translocated snakes, or they did this, and they found these other results, and none of their snakes died. And so, you know, like, what's the problem? And why can't we just use their results when we talk about this? But I hope that I've convinced you that it's a complicated issue. It's not black and white. Some snakes will survive translocation within or without of their home ranges, others won't. And so what can we do to try to improve this as much as possible has been kind of the focus of this presentation. This is why it doesn't always succeed. There are so many factors playing into the survival of that individual snake, the survival of the population, and the tolerance of people in the area for doing any sort of management of the snakes. So I'm not going to click through all this, but you know, there are a number of things that play into whether the snakes return, whether they survive, how close they are to people. Stress is an area we don't know as much about this. Some studies have showed that effects of stress are probably not such a big deal, especially in shorter distance translocations. Other studies are more equivocal. There are a number of factors that we just haven't considered. In the Southwest, we are moving a lot of snakes. What are the effects of snake fungal disease, which is a highly transmissible pathogen that affects the respiratory system and the skin of snakes? If we're moving a number of snakes and we're not practicing good hygiene, are we actually translocating a huge amount of snake fungal disease into our populations? What about genetics? Those narrow-headed garter snakes that were salvaged and then translocated, or in this case, they were repatriated. They had mixed genetic parentage, and some of them actually came from stock that was not native to the area. So there are just things that we can do to think about this and help us kind of improve our strategies, knowing that it's really complicated. And so the more planning we can do ahead of time, the better. This is a question I get all the time. Okay, you've told me all the stuff, okay, but whatever, I need to move the snake, it's in my yard. So for those people, here's my answer. If you have a snake in your yard, move it a short distance. If you want it to maximize its chances of survival, move it a short distance. A few meters, a few yards. Move it definitely in the Southwest, move it within its home range, less than a kilometer. And make sure that the place that you go for it, don't move it into an area that's near a road if possible. Don't move it into really different habitat. Don't move it into an area where it's very exposed and could be subject to human or other predators. Make sure that it has places people or from other predators, burrows, potentially good hibernation sites if you need that sort of thing. In the fall, you have a snake on the trail at Montezuma Castle. We know that there are certain hibernation sites in this area. In the fall, we move them toward those hibernation sites. In the spring, the snakes go away from the hibernation sites. Just be mindful of season when you're doing these translocations, especially if you're moving them a fair distance. Rattlesnakes are ectotherms. It doesn't take very long before their body temperature is the same temperature of their environment. So think about that for any snake that's being translocated, and please use humane handling and transport of the snake. Many snakes do survive mitigation translocation, but there are things that we can do to help them. We need to know more about the snake's biology. We need to include the human perspective and recognize that people are genuinely fearful of snakes. And so the more that we can do to educate people about the real threat of snake bite and safe practices for handling them if that time arises, the better off snake conservation and success rates will be with translocation. Short distance translocation is optimal. Another thing I often hear as well, translocation work hasn't been done in this species in this area. I don't think we need to keep doing those studies. I think we need to think about how do we manage better for snakes, try to keep them in place. What kind of translocations can we do that actually solve the issue of getting people and snakes away from each other, but protecting the snakes? And then I think the more and more I think about this, the more I keep thinking, this is a situation that needs some deeper thought. And here I am kind of going out on that limb again, but as humans, we have to coexist with snakes, whether we want to or not. We will live with them. They will live with us. And so this idea that if we have an animal that we don't like, we consider it to be a nuisance, we can just disappear it. I think that's an inappropriate response. I think we really need to focus on knowing more about snakes. What are their inner lives? If I take this animal who's been associated with these other animals its entire life, and it has this whole social structure, has a home range it's familiar with, has its favorite spots, and I move it somewhere else, what does that do to that animal? And who am I to be an animal that has that sort of effect on that other animal? So I really think we need to think more carefully about these translocation efforts before we do them, and try to convey that to people who are asking for translocations as well. A couple of wrap-up slides. This talk, as you probably have guessed by now, wouldn't be possible without the assistance of many people, starting with my family. This is my Aunt Bernie here, showed holding a very young narrow-headed garter snake. My Aunt Bernie was a major influence in my life, and I just can't thank her enough for all the work that she's done to inspire me, and my brother as well. Thank you both. Janie Achagush, Forest Service biologist and longtime volunteer in my research. My work would not be possible without all the efforts of volunteers who have helped with my work. My mentors, my friends, Roger Repp, Tucson Herpetological Society when I first met him, and Gordon Schuett, one of my PhD advisors. Thank you to all the human folks who've really helped me with my research. And lastly, I wouldn't be here without my snakes. And really, they are the reason why I continue to do what I do, and they keep me going. And I just basically have to give them the credit for everything that I've done. Many of them have suffered immensely at my hands, and they're doing their part for conservation. And so I honor their sacrifices. And I'm just so happy that they shared their lives with me. So there's an email address there for me. Please email me if you have questions at any time about any topic related to translocation or anything that's been discussed today, or I can put you in touch with other folks if you want more information. So thank you. Appreciate your attendance and your listening.
Thank you so much, Erika. That was great. Yeah, so if you have questions, you can put them in the chat. I'm going to look at the ones that we had come in early to see if there was anything there that you didn't already cover, but I know you worked some of those into your presentation. And also I saw that somebody already did this, but you're welcome now to turn on your cameras and unmute. And maybe if you have a question that you'd prefer to ask that way versus typing in the chat, do the little hand raise thing. It's probably a control along the bottom of your screen. And we can get to your questions that way. But yeah, I think you actually covered this one. I saw this reference, I think, on one of your slides, but asking about comparing ruber, which are red diamond rattlesnakes, to Western diamondback rattlesnakes and how well one species does versus the other. But I think that was on one of your slides where red diamond rattlesnakes moved, still had some differences, like they moved a little bit more, even though the mortality wasn't as bad as it was for what you found with Western diamondbacks.
Sure. And actually, I was thinking about that particular study a little more. One of the things that I'm wondering about is the influence of habitat suitability and richness of habitat. So it could be in some of these studies where snakes are doing better, that they have a shorter hibernation period. They don't have to go underground as long during the winter. But also maybe that, I don't know this, but maybe the habitat sources are richer. So maybe there's just a higher prey base. And for whatever reason, maybe certain species are just more adaptable because their habitats are more suitable.
Gotcha.
It's a good question. things.
Yeah, it is. I think, as a general, people often, when they ask me questions, and especially when I'm doing public outreach, but this is true of some scientists too, that we kind of want to lump all snakes together, and it's just like, they're all different species. I mean, especially reaching outside like a relatively small group like rattlesnakes, but why would we expect them to all respond the same way to anything?
Sure.
So another question we had, and I'm not sure if you did cover this. Is there any, have there been any studies or data on the outcomes of moving a single snake versus a multiple snake translocation? Like, do they do better if they have buddies or family members? They don't specify, so I don't know if they're talking, because I would assume with a lot of the conservation reintroductions and movements, like those are probably often with groups and probably less likely with the nuisance situations.
That's true. So many of the mitigation translocations are just single individuals that are dumped off. But in certain circumstances, folks have moved nuisance dens, hibernation dens of rattlesnakes. So there have been either developments or places where snakes were inhabiting like old foundations. And so in a few cases, which are not very well published, you kind of have to hunt for those. Folks have moved entire dens, and those animals have pretty high success rates. So I think there is something to moving the social groups. And if you don't know what the social group of an animal is because you just happen to find it, that's not helpful. But if you know that you have a den, for sure you want to move those animals together. It's a really good question. That's an area where more research about sociality needs to tie into management of the animals. We just don't know enough.
Yeah, that's a dream project, sociality. and also really complicated. So Emily Taylor, hi Emily, ask a good question. What do you think is the most effective outreach method to make people fear snakes less?
I think the most effective outreach is any outreach whatsoever. The one thing that I'm not so keen on that I've seen, and this isn't so common as it used to be, I think, but there used to be some early TV shows where people would do outreach, but they would sensationalize the snakes. They'd be like, oh, look at me. I'm handling this really scary, big, crazy animal that's likely to hurt me. That is the least effective because that reinforces people's fears and puts humans on a different level than the snake. Like, I am going to dominate this fearful beast. That is not useful. But in terms of the other outreach, promoting snakes, promoting coexistence, I mean, I have a lot of situations where people tell me they hate snakes and they tell me about all the snakes they killed. That's really common. And so my approach is, well, you had a situation where it's near your yard, you needed to move it. I understand that. Let's think about maybe, next time, here's a pair of snake tongs. Here, I'm going to show you how to use these. Maybe safer for you, so you're not going to hurt yourself or your family members won't get hurt. Why don't we take these tongs and we'll practice picking up the snake and moving it just a short distance? It's a hard question to answer, but I think just the more that we can do to expose people to what snakes are really like, the better off we'll be. And not to belabor this point, but one of the best successes that I've had with people is talking about how old the snakes get, talking about Melissa's work, which pretty much do this every time I give a talk. I talk about Melissa's work and direct people to ask. And then just talking about, different things about how cool they are. One rattlesnake population can remove 35% of the rodents. Montezuma Castle National Monument in a given year just because of the predatory influence of the snakes. Just throwing out those kind of cool tidbits about snakes is anything to kind of make people. It's not that we want to humanize the snakes, but we want to put them on an equal playing field with us as other beings in the world.
Yeah, I think people are often afraid in thinking about and using the term like humanize or anthropomorphizing is it's kind of interesting because it's like that is assuming that humans are like this special category over here when really we're just another animal. And so in the same way that you shouldn't expect different species to all behave exactly the same, you shouldn't expect all animals to not share any traits with each other because we are all animals. And so I think I was going to hold this until the end of the Q&A, but this question and a lot of your responses just rolled real nicely into this. And you and Emily and I are involved with this summer at the Biology of the Pit Viper conference. ASP is organizing a symposium on coexisting with snakes. And we're going to be talking about how to be a better advocate, like what are ways, both sharing experience from all the different people attending. We're also going to have a panel of experts who've been doing this for some time. Like for instance, Erika's on that panel, as am I, to just get together and talk about what has worked, what's not worked. And maybe the highlight of that symposium is there's a graduate student who has just conducted a study looking at how effective different types of messaging, so talking about things like their social behavior versus ecosystem services, like how many rodents they can eat, and what is the most effective type of message for different groups. And I am not going to spoil those results because we'll probably have her on Snakes or Everything, but she's also going to be at that symposium. So certainly we've been advertising this on social and in our email, but if you haven't heard about the symposium and like Emily, you can't wait, I can't either, definitely send us an email and we'd be happy to point you in the right direction for how you can find out how to participate in that. And I'm also looking into if there's any way that we can live stream that for people who can't make it, because I understand that travel is still something that people are hesitant to do. I am as well. I'm lucky enough that I can drive to it, but that's not the case for everybody. All right. So we're at an hour. So I know we've still got some questions. Brian Sullivan, did you have a question? I noticed you turned your camera on. Did you want to ask Erika something? No? Okay.
No, I just did it so she saw a face instead of a black screen. Good job, Erika. I've got to go in a couple of minutes, so I will tell you that.
Well, thanks. It was nice to see you again, Brian. And I can't wait for your talk at the Southwest Park Conference, which is also having a whole session on translocation, not specific to snakes, but reptiles and amphibians in general. So if you're really interested in this topic, that might be another one to check out for sure. So let's see. I'm not sure if there's a question. Let's see. So Seal Klinger asked in the chat or commented, thank you for an incredibly helpful and compassionate presentation. Do you have any suggestions for training dog owners who say rattlesnakes are going to bite their dogs? We've had dogs for 25 years without problems and live in an area where rattlesnake for dogs is available, but the humans need to hear better ideas from us.
So this is not an area that I've spent a lot of time researching. Obviously, I know that there are these snake avoidance classes you can enroll your dogs into. I've heard that the way that they treat the snakes, whether they're humane or not, can vary. So I'd advise you to do some research into that to make sure that program that you could select would be the most humane possible. Melissa or maybe somebody else would have more of an idea about this.
Emily Taylor, I know, has worked with a dog trainer who is based out of Southern California, but they give trainings all over. Like they even do some as far as northern New Mexico. Emily, if you have that link handy, that would be great. Or Seal, I know how to get a hold of you. So if Emily can't find it, I will find that just in case that they provide something near you, because Seal's also in California, although northeastern California, I think.
I'll put it in the chat for sure. They do go to Northern California. Their name's Canine Natural Solutions. I'll put it in there in a minute. And then just Seal's asking too about how do we train the owners? And yeah, I mean, I've watched the rattlesnake aversion training, and I think it's actually pretty great. So I do recommend it just in case, because you never know when your luck's going to run out. But certainly outreach to people is great too.
True. Yeah. I think at least everything I've heard about those in particular, they are really great trainers. I've also heard some not great stories. So it's just, like with a lot of things that are kind of new, your mileage may vary. Let's see. Let me double check in the chat. I don't think there are any more questions. And since it's after 6, I think it's about time to wrap it up. And Emily did put that link in the chat. So for anyone else that wants to grab it, I looked at that and thought it said social rattlesnake avoidance training. It's like, no, don't avoid the social rattlesnakes. Yeah. Oh, sorry. So it's not a complicated link. So just in case people, anyone can't see the chat, it's SoCalRattlesnakeAvoidanceTraining.com. No dashes or anything in there. Yeah. So thank you, everybody, again for coming. I'm going to flip over to share my screen again. And I just want to let everyone know, especially those who are watching the non-live version of this on YouTube later or Facebook or wherever, that we'll be monitoring the comments here. So if you have a question, we'll be sure to get to those, pass them along to Erika if we can't answer them ourselves, and get your questions answered. And thanks again, Erika, for being our guest today. Everyone else who tuned in, our supporters who make this and all of our other work possible. Snakes still have a ton of things to teach us. So I hope you'll join us next time on Snakes Are Everything, which you can find more about at the website snakes.ngo/everything. Take care, and thank you, everybody, for all you do for snakes every day. Bye-bye.